The concept of nurture kinship in the anthropological study of human social relationships highlights the extent to which such relationships are brought into being through the performance of various acts of nurture between individuals. Additionally, the concept highlights ethnographic findings that, in a wide swath of human societies, people understand, conceptualize and symbolize the relationships predominantly in terms of giving, receiving and sharing nurture. The concept stands in contrast to the earlier anthropological concepts of human kinship relations being fundamentally based on blood ties, some other form of shared substance, or a proxy for these, and the accompanying notion that people universally understand the social relationships predominantly in these terms. The nurture kinship perspective on the ontology of social ties and how people conceptualize them has become stronger in the wake of David M. Schneider's influential critique of the study of kinship and Holland's subsequent social bonding and nurture kinship, demonstrating that as well as the ethnographic record, biological theory and evidence also more strongly support the nurture perspective than the blood perspective. Both Schneider and Holland argue that the earlier blood theory of kinship derived from an unwarranted extension of symbols and values from anthropologists' own cultures. Intellectual background. Reports of kinship ties being based on various forms of shared nurture date back at least to William Robertson Smith's compiled lectures on the religion of the Semites. According to antique ideas, those who eat and drink together are by this very act tied to one another by a bond of friendship and mutual obligation. The idea that kinship is not purely an affair of birth, but may be acquired, has quite fallen out of our circle of ideas. At this stage, Robertson Smith interpreted the kinship ties emerging from the sharing of food as constituting an alternative form of the sharing of substance, aside from the sharing of blood, a genetic substance which many anthropologists assumed was the natural basis of social ties. However, later observations focused on the nurturing qualities of food-sharing behavior, allowing a potential distinction between the earlier emphasis on kinship as shared substance and kinship as performance. I want to examine the human relationships of a primitive society as determined by nutritional needs, showing how hunger shapes the sentiments which bind together the members of each social group. By what means is this fundamental biological want fulfilled in a given environment, and what forms of human activities and social groupings are so derived? Sometimes the line between conceiving of kinship as substance or as nurture is blurred by using both concepts. For example, the substance of food or milk may be conceived as the medium or vehicle through which the nurturing behavior is performed. The notion that it is the nurturing acts themselves that create social ties between people has developed most noticeably since the 1970s. The Navajo never mention common substance in finding or invoking kinship ties or norms. Kinship is defined in terms of the acts of giving birth and sharing sustenance. The primary bond in the Navajo kinship system is the mother-child bond, and it is in this bond that the nature and meaning of kinship become clear. In Navajo culture, kinship means intense, diffuse, and enduring solidarity, and this solidarity is realized in actions and behavior befitting the cultural definitions of kinship solidarity. Just as a mother is one who gives life to her children through birth and sustains the life by providing them with loving care, assistance, protection, and sustenance, kinsmen are those who sustain each other's life by helping one another, protecting one another, and by the giving or sharing of food and other items of subsistence. Where this kind of solidarity exists, kinship exists. Where it does not, there is no kinship. The term nurture kinship may have been first used in the present context by Watson, who contrasted it with nature kinship. Since the 1970s, an increasing number of ethnographies have documented the extent to which social ties in various cultures can be understood to be built upon nurture acts. Ethnographic examples: Marshall on the Truk of Micronesia. All sibling relationships, natural or created, involve the height of sharing and feelings of strong sentimental attachment. In Truke's kinship, actions speak louder than words. Tongue must be demonstrated by nurturant acts. Truke's kinship pivots on the fulcrum of nurturance, a fact partially understood by Ruth Goodenough, who noted the intense concentration on problems of nurture, taking care of and being cared for by others. In GTS, nurture is the nature of Truke's kinship. Gao on the Piro of Amazonia. As a child begins to eat real food, and to walk and eventually to talk, its relationship to its parents changes from one in which the parents take care that their physical connection to the body of the child does not harm it, into one in which gifts of food, given out of love for the child, evoke the child's love for its parents and other kin. Older siblings are very important here. From birth, the baby is frequently picked up and held by its older brothers and sisters. As it learns to walk and talk, its closest physical ties are with such siblings, for they are its constant companions and they eat and sleep together. Such intimate ties with siblings replace the earlier one with parents as the child grows. Thomas on the Temene Bondro of Madagascar. Yet just as fathers are not simply made by birth, neither are mothers, and although mothers are not made by custom, they, like fathers, can make themselves through another type of performatively constituted relation, the giving of nurture. Relations of ancestry are particularly important in contexts of ritual, inheritance and the defining of marriageability and incest. They are in effect the structuring structures of social reproduction and intergenerational continuity. Father, mother and children are, however, also performatively related through the giving and receiving of nurture. Like ancestry, relations of nurture do not always coincide with relations by birth, but unlike ancestry, nurture is a largely ungendered relation, constituted in contexts of everyday practical existence, in the intimate, familial and familiar world of the household, and in ongoing relations of work and consumption, of feeding and farming. Story on the Hoti of Venezuelan Guiana. It was my Hoti friends who, through the rejection of my expectations that I would be able to collect genealogical information, brought me to the idea that dwelling together and particularly the notions of consumption and ingestion are, for them, fundamental to social identity. Whenever I attempted to discover if there were ideas of genealogical relatedness between kin, I was told that there is nothing that links a parent to the children or siblings to each other, apart from the bonds of affection and sentiment that they feel for each other. In other words, there is nothing more to relatedness than those things that link all people together. Viegas on a Bahian Amerindian community in Brazil. Adults who early in their lives had been taken to become raised children stated clearly that the situation had never displeased them. They maintained that they belonged to the woman who cared for or raised them, and it is to her that they want the children to become attached. Although they recognize who the país legitimos are, it is those who have cared for a person for a longer period of their childhood that are considered mother and father. It is in this sense that kinship is constituted as memory of being related through caring and feeding, along the lines developed in large part by Peter Gowan within other South Amerindian contexts. Link with attachment theory. It can be seen from the ethnographies that several anthropologists have found that describing social ties in terms of emotional attachments is appropriate. This has prompted some to suggest that an interdisciplinary collaboration might be useful. Bowlby argued that attachment behavior in humans and other animals is instinctive, i.e., that evolutionary pressures have selected this psychological trait. Now, might Bowlby's realist approach, which defines these behaviors as universal and instinctive, which examines their consequences through naturalistic observation, and which stresses the central role in intensifying human relatedness, be a useful starting point for anthropologists? Extrapolating from the work of Myers, one could make the case that all anthropological discussions of relatedness, e.g., the accounts by Malinowski, Mauss, and a great many others of the ways in which gift exchange in reciprocity, or commensality and the sharing of substance, help to constitute human relatedness, are also by definition dealing with intractable problems of attachment and separation in social life. Within the discipline of psychology, the formation of social and emotional ties are treated by attachment theory. Drawing on animal studies from the 1950s onwards, John Bowlby and colleagues described how, for all primates, including humans, the reliable provision of nurture and care leads to strong bonds of attachment between the carer and cared for. Attachment theorists now suggest that infants are biologically predisposed to emit signals such as tracking visually, crying, smiling, vocalizing, clinging, etc., to elicit nurturance and proximity not only to the mother, but also to the father or any other caregiver. Consistent and prompt responding to infants' signals leads to infants' perception of adults as concerned, predictable, and reliable, and to the formation of secure attachment. Mothers, fathers, and other caregivers, by their different styles of responding, create a different set of expectations and an array of attachment relationships of various qualities and flavors. Following the nurture-kinship approach thus allows a synthesis between the extensive cross-cultural data of ethnographers and the long-standing findings of psychology on the nature of human bonding and emotional ties. Link with evolutionary biology. David Schneider suspected that the traditional anthropological models of blood kinship were not mirrored by the scientific facts of biology. The last few pages of my book, American Kinship, make the point that the biological elements have a symbolic significance. They constitute an integrated set of symbols in the sense that they are a model for how life, in certain of its aspects, is constituted and should be lived. The symbols are biological, in the sense that the culturally given definition of the symbol system is that it is derived from the facts of biology, as a process of nature itself, but it is fundamental to our understanding that we appreciate that these biological elements are symbols and that the symbolic reference are not biology as a natural process at all. It is even a moot question as to whether the symbols derive from the facts of nature and the facts of biology as these can be determined scientifically. What is indisputable is that the symbols are formed of elements which in native culture are defined as biological, particularly as aspects of the reproductive process. What is disputable is whether they in fact derive from, or mirror, or are models formed after the scientific facts of biology. I do not think that they are, but this subject is best left to another time. Hollins subsequently showed that Schneider's intuition in regard to the scientific facts was correct. In evolutionary biology, the theory treating the evolution of social cooperation emerged in a formal version in the 1960s and 1970s in the form of inclusive fitness theory, and a related theory, kin selection. The theory specifies that one criterion for the evolution of certain kinds of social traits is a statistical association of identical genes, as would exist when close genetic relatives associate with one another. Early applications of the theory applied to humans took as the starting position the former anthropological perspective that human kinship is fundamentally based on blood ties. However, these extensions emerged at precisely the time that anthropology was reflexively critiquing this blood assumption behind traditional kinship theorizing. This reversion to blood led some anthropologists to strongly attack the emerging biological perspectives as suffering the same ethnocentric assumptions that the anthropologists themselves had recently eschewed. This clash of perspectives led to something of a standoff and a lack of communication between the disciplines, resulting in little cooperation and progress for 3 decades. The standoff was resolved by Holland's social bonding and nurture kinship, which revisited biological inclusive fitness theory to draw a distinction between the statistical evolutionary mechanisms for the emergence of social traits and the non-deterministic proximate mechanisms, through which they are expressed. In a stricter interpretation of the theory, a statistical association of related genes is understood as a necessary condition for the evolutionary emergence of certain traits relating to social cooperation. However, this does not entail that the proximate mechanisms governing the expression of such social traits in primates and humans necessarily depends on conditions of genetic relatedness per se. For the vast majority of social mammals, including primates and humans, the formation of social bonds are based on familiarity from an early developmental stage, and the same kinds of mechanisms that attachment theorists have outlined. In short, in humans and in other primates, genetic relatedness is not necessary for the attachment bonds to develop, and it is the performance of nurture that underlies such bonds and the enduring social cooperation that typically accompanies them. Therefore, the nurture kinship perspective enables common ground between evolutionary biology, psychology, and socio-cultural anthropology on the topic of social bonding and cooperation, without reductionism or positing a deterministic role to genes or genetic relatedness in the mechanisms through which social behaviors are expressed.